Chapter 15 of A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Dave Wills. A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines, Chapter 15, Sir Francis Drake. Probably the greatest hero in all Great Britain's naval history is Sir Francis Drake, who carried England's flag to the uttermost corners of the earth and made it glorious when Queen Elizabeth was on the English throne. Drake was the oldest of a family of 12 sons and was born in Devonshire in 1539. He was an active and adventurous boy, fond of all athletic games, and early showing a taste for the sea that seemed to run in his family, for his father had served in the navy in the time of Henry VIII, and his cousin Sir John Hawkins was sailing to the coast of Guinea to bring back slaves. The talent that Drake had for the sea was soon observed by the keen-eyed Hawkins, and before long Drake became his apprentice and quickly learned the ins and outs of seamanship. He rapidly made a name for himself as a brave and skilful sailor, and before long accompanied Hawkins on his trips to Guinea after Negro slaves, trips in which Drake was always in the fore when any adventure of a particularly dangerous nature was undertaken. The slave trade was a perfectly honorable calling in those days, and Drake succeeded in it beyond his hopes, amassing much money with which he helped his younger brothers and did many kindnesses for his family. But the slave trade itself soon grew too small to satisfy Hawkins, who sought a field for broader adventures. All the Western Ocean lay open to him, and mustering a squadron, he offered Drake the command of one of the vessels, which were to go to the West Indies and engage in trading or fighting with the Spaniards, who had at that time almost a monopoly of the waters where Columbus had sailed some 70 years before. Spain and England were not openly at war when Hawkins was planning this voyage, but in unknown waters all law stopped, and it was not infrequent for Spanish and English vessels to fall afoul of each other, with little or nothing said about it afterwards in the courts or embassies. Queen Elizabeth hated the Spaniards, and was glad to do them all the mischief she could, but she did not dare to go to war with them at that time, or to give too open encouragement to her sea captains. They knew none the less that the sight of Spanish gold under English hatches was pleasant to good Queen Bess, and likely to result in honor, wealth, and preferment for themselves. It was on Drake's first expedition to the West Indies that he conceived a hatred for the Spaniards that was to last all his life, as the result of the black treachery they played on Hawkins. After cruising along the western coast of what is now Florida, and being unable to find a proper harbor there, Hawkins set sail for Mexico, and dropped anchor at a Spanish port in that country. While he was riding at anchor, a large fleet of Spanish vessels arrived, and finding the English in possession and holding a strong position, agreed to let them sail away unmolested. Later, however, when the English had consented to these terms, and after the Spanish admiral had entertained the English officers in his own cabin, the Spaniards treacherously attacked the English, killing a number that had gone ashore before they could regain their boats, and engaging in a sea fight with Hawkins' squadron, in which the English lost all but 2 of their ships, the Judith, Drake's vessel, and the Minion, on which Hawkins happened to be when the fight commenced. These 2 ships escaped and made their way back to England separately, Drake vowing vengeance against the Spaniards, and indeed they had made a dangerous enemy in this bold sailor, who very shortly paid them in full for the base treatment they had given him. As soon as he was in England, Drake commenced fitting out 2 vessels as raiders for the purpose of harrying Spanish ships in the waters of the West Indies, and if possible to capture the Spanish holdings on land and place them beneath the English flag. Particularly did he desire to get his fingers into the rich heaps of gold that were conveyed by great Spanish ships or galleons back from the New World to the treasury of King Philip. With these ends in view, Drake landed his men secretly on the coast of Central America, near the present location of the Panama Canal, and by a bold surprise attack captured the Spanish town named Nombre de Dios. He was finally compelled to abandon the town because he was greatly outnumbered by the Spaniards, who, through a mishap in his plans, were enabled to collect their forces and advance against him. But Drake made good this check by another daring plan that was skillfully executed, and that caused great discomfiture to the Spanish official. This was nothing less than to ambush and attack the Spanish treasure trains that carried gold and jewels, riches wrung from the natives by Spanish greed. Leaving a small number of men in charge of his ships, Drake advanced into the wild and tropical country of Central America along the route that the treasure trains traveled. When the tinkling of the bells on the harnesses of the pack animals warned him of the approach of the Spaniards who guarded the treasure, Drake concealed his men at the side of the road, and rushing forward with a shout, attacked and captured the train, almost before the astonished Spaniards knew that there was an enemy in the vicinity. Rich stores of gold and jewels were found in the mule packs, more, in fact, than the English men could carry back with them, and with cheers and rejoicing the little band of adventurers made their way back to the harbor where they had left their ships. When they reached it, however, no ships were to be seen. They feared that the Spaniards had captured or destroyed their vessels, and that they were marooned in a hostile and dangerous country. But Drake, with his characteristic boldness, formed a plan that delivered them from their difficulty. From the logs on the shore he ordered his men to build a raft, and with their hatchets they hewed out oars. A sail was contrived from a large biscuit sack, and with a few of his best men Drake put to sea on this strange craft, searching for his ships. The raft had been built so hurriedly that at times he was up to his waist in water, but he was rewarded at last by finding his two vessels safe and sound in a little cove, where they had been taken to avoid some Spanish warships that were in the neighborhood. Returning to his men at the helm of his own vessel, the treasure was soon aboard, and with a large cargo of gold, silver, and sparkling jewels, Drake headed for England, where a rousing welcome was given him. Elizabeth, however, did not dare openly to approve of an act that secretly brought her the utmost satisfaction. For the time, at any rate, Drake got little thanks for his exploits, and there was even talk of returning the captured treasure to the Spaniards. Drake then engaged in a war in Ireland, where he proved himself almost as good a soldier as he was a sailor. But even while enjoying his congenial occupation of fighting, he longed to set forth on another great adventure, the idea of which had come to him while in the Central American jungle, from which he had first set eyes on the far-off waters of the Pacific Ocean. The idea was to carry the English flag through the Strait of Magellan and bear the colors of Queen Bess to waters where they had never been seen before. Up to that time, only the Spanish had rounded South America and brought their civilization to its northwestern shores, and the new venture, if successful, would mean much to England. But Drake feared that the Queen would not approve of the idea, and for a time cherished it only in his own mind, waiting a more favorable opportunity to lay it before the Queen. In the meantime, he fell in with an English army officer named Thomas Doughty, who became his close friend. Doughty was greatly interested in Drake's idea of sailing the Pacific, and promised to get Sir Christopher Hatton, one of Elizabeth's most influential advisers, to intercede for Drake with the Queen. Hatton talked with Drake and cordially approved the plan. In command of a squadron of 5 tight little vessels, Drake sailed westward, while the trumpets blared and the cannon boomed in his honor. Drake himself was in command of a little ship, which he called the Golden Hind, and Doughty was his second in command over the entire squadron. The ships were admirably fitted out for those times, with every necessity and every comfort and luxury. Drake and his officers dined from silver dishes on the choicest food and wines. His stores included materials for trading with the natives, as well as all the scientific instruments then applied to the art of navigation. After sinking some unimportant Spanish ships, the English squadron captured a large Portuguese galleon, from which they took valuable treasure. The Portuguese had been unfriendly to the English on more than one occasion, and this was Drake's way of informing them that such had been the case. And after a long voyage he came to the mouth of the River de la Plata in South America, dropping anchor at the entrance to that great stream. Fires blazed on the shore, and weird figures were seen dancing around the flames. They were the savage natives, praying to their heathen gods for the shipwreck of Drake's party, for they believed that by their prayers and fires a host of devils would alight upon the English vessels and destroy them. Drake himself was too eager to continue his voyage to think of landing, and pointed his prows southward, bound for the Strait of Magellan. After a battle with the gigantic and savage Patagonians, in which Drake saved his men from massacre by his usual quick decision and energy, he continued his voyage until trouble that had developed in his crew compelled him to take action against his friend and lieutenant, Doughty. It seems that even before they sailed from England, Doughty had become jealous of Drake and had commenced to work for his undoing. And now proofs were only too evident that he had tried to provoke a mutiny in the crew. He was called before a court consisting of Drake's officers and was found guilty. And then Drake, in spite of his grief that he had been deceived by his most trusted friend, decided that stern measures were necessary to preserve his authority over the men. He told Doughty that he had but one course to take, and that was to punish him for his crime. But he gave him the choice of 3 fates: to be executed then and there, or put ashore to fend for himself among the savages, or to be cast in chains into the hold of the ship and tried by his peers on the return to England. The unhappy Doughty asked time to think over what he should choose, and this was granted. On the following morning he was taken before Drake, and with courageous mien declared that he preferred to be executed rather than be left among the savages or taken home as a prisoner. And in a few hours, and before the entire company, Doughty met his fate. But he did not place his head upon the block until he had sat at dinner with Drake himself and shared communion with him. And after this Drake continued his voyage until he found himself at the southernmost part of South America. Beating his way through the dangerous Strait of Magellan, Drake tried to sail northwards, but was driven back by severe gales and contrary winds until it seemed as though the spirit of the new ocean had arisen in wrath, forbidding his further progress. He was even driven south of the strait to Cape Horn, where he landed and looked from the southernmost pinnacle of the cape to the mysterious southern sea, declaring triumphantly that he had been farther south than any man in the world, and had placed his foot on the extreme of the new continent. Then, all at once, the weather changed, and Drake sailed rapidly up the coast. By this time only one ship remained to him, for storms had scattered his squadron, and he had destroyed one of his own ships, thinking he had too many to hold together. Another basely deserted him in the strait and sailed back to England. In the Golden Hind, however, he himself met all obstacles and continued his voyage where no English keel had ever cut water before. Coming to the northern part of South America, Drake was given word by the natives that a Spanish galleon with a cargo of treasure lay near at hand. And swooping down on the great vessel before the Spaniards were aware of his presence, he captured it and transferred the treasure to the Golden Hind. He then got news of a second galleon, which he pursued, and when he boarded her, discovered that she too bore rich bars of gold and silver destined for the treasure house of the King of Spain. He had now accomplished his purpose and sailed in the Pacific. He had beneath his hatches a treasure that would have gladdened the heart of Midas, a harvest of the yellowest gold and the whitest silver, of sparkling gems, rich silks and spices, and many costly curios that he had gathered in his voyage. He believed, however, that the Spaniards would be watching the Strait and Cape Horn to intercept him, and planned to try to find a passage around the northern part of the continent. In sailing north, he dropped anchor at a harbor not far from the Golden Gate, and here he had his first experience with North American Indians. He found these savages very different from the treacherous natives of South America. They greeted him with the utmost ceremony, treating him as a god and bringing him a profusion of gifts of various kinds. With Indian guides, the English hunted and slew the deer with which the region abounded, and shared the wigwams of the redskins in ceremonial gatherings. When they finally took their departure, the savages made bitter lamentation and stood on the hilltops waving their farewells until the sails of Drake's little ship had sunk beneath the horizon. Drake had now altered his plan of sailing north and conceived the bolder project of sailing directly across the Pacific Ocean to the Far East, from which he could proceed to the Cape of Good Hope and skirt the coast of Africa. So he resolutely turned his prow into an unknown sea, and after 68 days sighted land. Again the savages crowded round his ship in their canoes, but they were far different from the Indians of California. These men were naked, with blackened teeth and sullen looks. Finding the ship not to their liking, they loosed a shower of stones, to which Drake responded by firing one of his cannon, which frightened them until they fell out of their canoes into the water, and remained there until the Golden Hind had sailed away. Drake stopped at many islands and traded with the natives he met there. He visited the Philippines and an island called Trinidad, where he received a native king who called on him with the utmost pomp and ceremony. This potentate was surrounded with grave old men with white beards who believed in the Mohammedan religion, and they welcomed Drake as though he himself were a mighty king. At the court of the king of Trinidad, Drake discovered a Chinaman who professed to be of royal blood, and gave him a courteous invitation to visit the Emperor of China. But Drake was eager to get home and continued his voyage as quickly as possible. He stopped at Java and then made for the Cape of Good Hope, which his followers declared was the fairest and most goodly cape in all the world, and the most welcome to set eyes on. Rounding the cape, he directed his course for Sierra Leone and the coast of Guinea, and coming into waters that he knew, he continued northwards until the shores of England were sighted from his masthead. And at last he dropped anchor triumphantly in Plymouth Harbor, after a voyage that had lasted 3 years. He had suffered from tempest, battle, and shipwreck, and on one occasion had run his vessel on the rocks while in Asiatic waters. He had taken a princely fortune from the Spaniards and engaged in fierce combats with them. He had accomplished more as a geographer and navigator than any Englishman up to this time, and had taken the English flag where it had never been seen before. And as a result of these exploits, all England rang with his fame. Songs were composed in his honor, and he was considered to be more than human by many people who held that only by magic could he have accomplished a voyage so miraculous. Elizabeth did not receive him with open favor at first, but her heart was high within her at Drake's success. At last she informed him that it was her pleasure to dine with him on the Golden Hind, which you may be sure was scoured and garnished for the occasion as never before. In the ship's cabin, Elizabeth and her courtiers feasted with Drake and his officers, and at the end of the dinner she asked the captain for his sword, a sword that she herself had presented to him before his departure for the West, and tapping him with it on the shoulder as he knelt before her, she knighted him and left his ship, while Drake himself remained on board to rejoice at the honor that had been bestowed on him. The dauntless skipper had returned in the nick of time to be of further service to his country, for England at last went openly to war with Spain, and Drake was put in command of a fleet to harry Spanish commerce. There were rumors of a great fleet that was being gathered by King Philip to invade England, but Drake met them more than halfway, and sailing into Spanish harbors inflicted such a blow on King Philip's navy that it took more than a year for him to get his ships again in such a condition that he could sail against English shores. As we have already told you in the last chapter, the King of Spain did at last send a mighty fleet of more than 150 great galleons to invade England and conquer the country. It was the proudest array of ships that the world had ever seen up to that time, with Spain's greatest sailors and generals in command, and a force of veteran soldiers aboard that was thought to be irresistible. Drake was at a game of bowls with Sir Walter Raleigh and Martin Frobisher when word was brought to him that the Spanish fleet had been sighted. The others quickly left their sport and were hurrying towards the harbor when Drake called after them and brought them back.
"There's plenty of time to finish the game and beat the Spaniards afterward,"
he said, laughing. He was as good as his word, and as one of the chief commanders of the English navy he did more than any other man to humble Spain's great fleet and weaken her power on the sea. While the great Spanish galleons were huddled in confusion, the swift English vessels bore down on them and raked them from stem to stern with musketry and cannon fire, sinking a great many vessels and throwing the entire fleet into hopeless disorder. The English also deftly maneuvered so that the Spaniards would be driven upon the dangerous reefs and shipwreck complete the havoc in the ranks of the hostile armada. Drake's fireships, like roaring furnaces, bore down on the Spaniards under full sail, and the light of the flames was reflected against the clouds as the galleons blew up and burned. A terrible gale completed what the English began, and the Spanish ships drove on the rocks by scores, where their crews were dashed to pieces or were killed or captured after making their way to shore. Spain's dream of conquering England was at an end, and Spain's supremacy upon the seas was ended also in favor of her younger rival. This was the crowning point of Drake's career and greatness. He was, most naturally, a national figure, the darling of the people and the court. Later he engaged in further voyages, but did not meet with his earlier success, and in 1596 he died at sea, not very far from the scene of his first victories, and the location of the modern Panama Canal. He was buried with high honors, and his coffin was lowered into the sea, draped in the English flag, while the English guns thundered a salute in honor of the great naval hero. End of chapter 15, recorded by Dave Wills.